The Royal Extortion. June 1215. A damp, foggy meadow at Runnymede, along the River Thames. King John of England sits inside a silk tent, surrounded by an army of angry, heavily armored barons. The king is furious, desperate, and backed into a corner. But to understand how a monarch ended up held hostage by his own nobility, you have to look into his ledger. King John is broke. He has just lost Normandy to the French at the disastrous Battle of Bouvines. To rebuild his army, John spent years turning England into a personal extortion ring. He invented outrageous new taxes. He seized the lands of dead nobles. He forced widows to pay massive fines to avoid being married off to his allies. For medieval kings, money is absolute power. Taxes are levied by divine right, not popular vote. If the king demands your inheritance, your horses, or your gold, you hand it over or face execution. But John pushed the extortion too far. He emptied the wallets of the most dangerous men in the kingdom. The barons decided that if the law wouldn't protect their wealth, their swords would. The revolt of the barons. The feudal system relies on a simple deal. The nobility provides knights and taxes, and the king provides protection and justice. King John broke that deal. He took the wealth, provided zero protection, and used the justice system as a weapon to destroy his political enemies. By May 1215, the barons had reached their breaking point. They renounced their sacred oaths of fealty to the crown. Led by a powerful nobleman named Robert Fitzwalter, the rebels marched on London and seized control of the city. London was the financial heart of the realm. Losing its tax revenues paralyzed the royal household. King John realized he was facing total military and financial bankruptcy. He couldn't pay his mercenary army, and his loyalists were abandoning him. He had no choice but to negotiate with the men he had spent a decade robbing. He agreed to meet the rebels at Runnymede to sign a peace treaty that would forever change the mechanics of Western wealth. The document at Runnymede. On June 15, 1215, royal scribes laid out a long piece of sheepskin parchment on a wooden table. The document was written in dense Latin script. It wasn't called a constitution. It was a list of 63 demands designed to put a permanent leash on the king's wallet. The rebels did not want to overthrow the monarchy. They were businessmen in armor who wanted to protect their assets. The document laid out strict rules for royal finance. The king could no longer seize property without immediate payment. He could no longer invent new taxes on a whim. Most importantly, Clause 12 stated that no extraordinary tax, known as scutage or shield money, could be imposed without the common consent of the realm. For the first time in Western history, a monarch was forced to admit that the money in his kingdom did not belong to him by divine right. The king's wallet was officially locked. The birth of tax consent. Before Runnymede, taxation was a one-way street. The king demanded, and the subject paid. Magna Carta fundamentally flipped this power dynamic, laying the groundwork for modern representative democracy. By forcing the king to seek common consent before levying taxes, Magna Carta created an early prototype of parliament. If the king wanted to fund a war, build a castle, or throw a royal wedding, he had to summon a council of barons, present his budget, and justify the expense. If the council didn't like the plan, they could simply say no and withhold the cash. This was the origin of the phrase, "no taxation without representation." It transformed taxes from a royal mugging into a legal contract between the state and the taxpayer. Money was no longer taken by force. It was granted by agreement. Clause 39 and property rights. While Magna Carta was written by wealthy elites for wealthy elites, one specific clause quietly planted the seeds for modern individual economic freedom. The famous Clause 39. Clause 39 stated, "No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." This was the invention of due process and property rights. Before this, if King John wanted your estate, he could declare you a traitor, send his knights to seize your cattle, and lock you in a tower without a trial. Under Clause 39, your property was protected by law. The state could not confiscate your home, your business, or your land without proving a crime in a court of law. This clause turned property from a temporary privilege granted by a king into an absolute right guarded by the legal system. The Council of 25. King John was notorious for breaking his promises. The barons knew that as soon as their army disbanded, John would tear up the parchment and resume robbing them. So they added an aggressive enforcement mechanism. Clause 61, known as the Security Clause. Clause 61 established a council of 25 barons, elected by the nobility. Their job was to act as a financial police force over the king. If King John violated any term of Magna Carta, the council had the legal right to seize the king's castles, confiscate his personal estates, and freeze his revenues until the wrong was corrected. This was revolutionary and deeply radical. It legalized rebellion. It proved that the king was not above the law. He was subject to it. If the monarch stepped out of line, his own subjects were legally authorized to shut down his income and seize his assets. The Pope's betrayal. King John had no intention of honoring the agreement. The moment he left Runnymede, he sent urgent, secret messengers to Rome, appealing to Pope Innocent III. John claimed he was forced to sign the document under duress, arguing it was an insult to royal authority. Pope Innocent III agreed. In August 1215, just 9 weeks after Magna Carta was sealed, the Pope issued a papal bull declaring the charter null and void of all validity forever. He excommunicated the rebel barons and released King John from his oath. The peace treaty collapsed instantly. England plunged directly into the First Barons' War, a brutal civil war that saw French troops invade London. King John went on a destructive campaign across the country, burning villages and looting estates to prove that no piece of sheepskin could limit his absolute power. The death of a tyrant. The Civil War reached a dramatic, bizarre climax in October 1216. As King John was crossing a tidal estuary known as the Wash in eastern England, disaster struck. The incoming tide caught his baggage train by surprise. The rising waters swept away the king's entire personal treasure, including his gold, his jewels, and the ancient crown jewels of England. All the wealth he had spent a lifetime stealing was swallowed by the sea in a matter of minutes. Broken, sick with dysentery, and emotionally defeated, King John died a few days later at Newark Castle. With John dead, his 9-year-old son, Henry III, took the throne. To end the Civil War and secure the boy's crown, the royal regents did something extraordinary. They reissued Magna Carta. They cleaned up the document, removed the Radical Council of 25, and officially issued it as royal law. The paper survived the king who tried to burn it. The DNA of modern capitalism. Magna Carta was reissued multiple times over the next century, eventually becoming the foundational bedrock of English common law. Its core principles traveled across the Atlantic 500 years later, directly inspiring the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The document signed in a muddy meadow in 1215 laid the structural DNA for modern capitalism. It established that property rights are sacred, that taxation requires consent, and that no government, whether run by a medieval king or a modern president, is above the law. When you sign a business contract, buy a house, or vote on a local tax ballot, you are using the legal architecture designed by a group of angry barons 800 years ago. Magna Carta proved that real power doesn't come from a crown or a sword. It comes from the rules written into the ledger. The next time you look at a tax deduction on your paycheck or sign a contract for a home loan, remember Runnymede. King John lost his wallet so that centuries later, the rest of the world could finally own theirs. The crown fell, but the ledger survived. We put a lot of efforts to make such informative stories for you. There is a subscribe button to value our efforts and make this channel big enough to bring more historical stories for you all. I hope you people like our videos. Comments down your topics if you want us to make videos on.